crystal chandelier above our table cast little rainbows across my wine glass as Dorian reached into his briefcase and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. My name was written across it in his assistant's handwriting, and something about the way he slid it toward me made my entire world tilt sideways. "Thanks for 8 incredible years, Nyla," he said. That same warm smile he'd worn when he'd invited me to this ridiculously expensive restaurant an hour earlier. "Unfortunately, we're restructuring your division. This is effective immediately." I stared at that envelope like it might bite me. 8 years. 8 years of 60-hour weeks. Of missing my nephew's first steps because I was in client meetings. Of building relationships that turned our failing department into the company's biggest moneymaker. And he was ending it between courses at some overpriced place where they charge $40 for a piece of fish. My name is Nyla, I'm 31 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like until that moment. Before I go any further, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching people. And also like, subscribe, and click the bell icon because what happened next is going to blow your mind, and I promise you've never heard a revenge story quite like this one. I opened that envelope with steady hands, even though everything inside me was screaming. Termination papers. Legal jargon about immediate cessation of duties. A severance package that was decent but not nearly enough for what I'd given them. "I hope you understand this isn't personal," Dorian continued, cutting into his steak like nothing had changed. "It's just business. The board wants to streamline operations." Just business. That phrase echoed in my head as I folded the papers and tucked them back into the envelope. I looked at this man who I'd worked beside for 8 years, who I'd helped make millions of dollars, who I'd trusted with my career and my future. "Of course," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Can you tell me more about the severance timeline?" He looked relieved that I wasn't crying or making a scene. "Smart girl," he said, and those 2 words hit me harder than the termination itself. Smart girl. Like I was some intern he was patting on the head instead of the woman who'd single-handedly saved his reputation more times than I could count. What Dorian didn't know was that I'd been watching him closely for months. Not because I suspected anything like this, but because something had felt off about our department's numbers. Resources that should have been allocated to us kept disappearing. Projects that should have been greenlit kept getting delayed. And meanwhile, he'd been having a lot of mysterious meetings with the executive team. I'd also been hearing whispers from clients about a potential acquisition our company was eyeing. A smaller competitor called Zenith Technologies that had been struggling publicly but held some incredibly valuable patents in artificial intelligence. Patents that would be worth hundreds of millions to whoever owned them. The pieces had started clicking together about 2 weeks before this lunch. I'd been staying late one evening when I saw Dorian in his office. Door closed, having what looked like an intense phone conversation. Through the glass, I could see spreadsheets on his computer screen, and something about his body language told me this wasn't a normal business call. The next morning, I'd done some digging. Not hacking or anything illegal, just using my legitimate access to financial reports and project databases. What I found made my blood run cold. Dorian had been systematically redirecting resources away from my division and into other departments, then using our artificially poor performance to argue that we needed to be restructured. Meanwhile, he'd been building a case to the board that Zenith Technologies was a failing company worth acquiring at a low price. But here's the thing about those patents everyone was after. I'd actually worked with some of Zenith's engineers at my previous company. I knew their technology was revolutionary, not outdated like Dorian was claiming in his reports. He was deliberately misrepresenting their value to keep their stock price low until our acquisition went through. My firing wasn't about restructuring. It was about removing the one person who might blow up his carefully constructed narrative. As we finished our meal, I watched Dorian check his phone repeatedly. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. He'd always been the type of executive who stayed calm under pressure, but today there was something different about his energy. "Is everything all right?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Oh, just some board stuff," he said dismissively. "Nothing you need to worry about anymore." That comment stung, but I kept my expression neutral. We made small talk about the weather and my plans for the transition period. He offered to write me a recommendation letter, which felt like salt in a wound I was still trying to understand. When the check came, he insisted on paying, which somehow made everything worse. Like this expensive lunch was supposed to soften the blow of destroying my career. "I really do wish things could have been different," he said as we stood to leave. "You're incredibly talented, Nyla. I'm sure you'll land on your feet." I thanked him for lunch and walked to my car in a daze. It wasn't until I was sitting in the parking garage that the full reality hit me. I was unemployed. After 8 years of dedicated service, I was starting over from scratch. But as I sat there, something shifted inside me. The hurt began transforming into something sharper, more focused. Dorian had made a mistake firing me this way. He'd underestimated what I knew and what I was capable of. That evening, I started making a list. Not a revenge fantasy, but a methodical inventory of everything I knew about the Zenith acquisition and Dorian's financial manipulations. I had access to reports, emails, and client conversations that painted a very different picture than what he was presenting to the board. I also started thinking about my network. 8 years in this industry had given me relationships that extended far beyond my former company, including my old professor from graduate school, Dr. Elena Vasquez, who'd become one of the most respected industry analysts in the country. The next morning, I called Elena and asked if she'd like to meet for coffee. We'd stayed in touch over the years, and she'd always been generous with her time when I had questions about market trends or needed a second opinion on analysis. "I'm working on some interesting research about undervalued assets in our sector," I told her over the phone. "I'd love to get your perspective on some patterns I'm seeing." We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where industry people went to have conversations they didn't want overheard in corporate lobbies. Elena was exactly as I remembered her: brilliant, direct, and always eager to discuss market inefficiencies. "So what's this research you're working on?" she asked after we'd caught up on personal news. I chose my words carefully. "I've been looking at some companies that seem to be trading below their actual value based on their technological assets. Specifically, I'm seeing a disconnect between public perception and underlying innovation in the AI patent space." Elena's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of market analysis she loved. "Can you give me a specific example?" "Have you looked at Zenith Technologies recently?" I asked. "Their stock has been declining for months, but when I examine their patent portfolio and the engineers they've hired, there's a real mismatch between market perception and actual capability." Elena pulled out her tablet and started taking notes. "That's interesting. I haven't done a deep dive on them recently. What specifically are you seeing?" I spent the next hour walking her through publicly available information about Zenith's patents, their hiring patterns, and their research publications. Everything I shared was either public record or information I'd legitimately gathered through client relationships. I never mentioned the acquisition or my suspicions about Dorian's manipulations. "This is fascinating," Elena said when I finished. "If you're right about their technological capabilities, their current valuation makes no sense." "That's exactly what I was thinking," I replied. "It seems like the market is missing something significant here." Elena left that coffee meeting energized about a potential research opportunity. I left feeling like I'd planted a seed that might grow into something much bigger. 3 days later, Elena published a detailed analysis titled "Hidden Innovation: Overlooked Value in AI Patent Leaders." The report highlighted Zenith Technologies as a company whose market value didn't reflect their actual technological assets. The impact was immediate. Zenith's stock price jumped 38% in the first day of trading after the report was released. Financial news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly everyone was talking about the hidden gem that analysts had been overlooking. I watched the stock price climb from my apartment, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. This was just the beginning. But I wasn't done. While Elena's report had disrupted Dorian's acquisition timeline, I still had bigger plans. During our termination lunch, I'd noticed something that he probably thought I'd missed. When Dorian had excused himself to take a phone call, I'd glanced at his open planner. Call it curiosity or instinct, but something about the way he'd been guarding it all lunch made me want to see what was so important. The page was covered with numbers and dates that didn't match anything I recognized from our standard financial reports. Revenue figures that were different from what we'd been reporting internally. budget allocations that seemed to move money between departments in ways that didn't make sense. I didn't take photos or steal anything. I just looked at those numbers and committed them to memory, the same way I'd trained myself to remember client details and project specifications. Over the next few days, I cross-referenced those figures with reports I'd saved from previous quarters. I'd always been meticulous about keeping copies of important documents, partly because I liked having comprehensive records, and partly because I'd learned not to trust that information would always be available when I needed it. The patterns that emerged were damning. Dorian had been systematically moving resources away from my division and into accounts that made our performance look worse than it actually was. Then, he'd been using our artificially poor results to justify arguments about market conditions and acquisition opportunities. It was sophisticated financial manipulation designed to create a narrative that would benefit his career and his acquisition plans. And it had worked perfectly until Elena's report destroyed his timeline. I had 3 board members' contact information from previous projects where I'd presented directly to leadership. These weren't social relationships, but they were professional connections who knew my work and had expressed respect for my analysis in the past. I spent an entire weekend crafting a memo that laid out the financial discrepancies I'd discovered. I was careful to present everything as questions rather than accusations, and I included supporting documentation that clearly showed the patterns without requiring any confidential information. I've been reviewing historical financial reports and noticed some discrepancies that may warrant further investigation. I wrote in my cover email. Given my recent transition away from the company, I thought it was important to bring these concerns to your attention before they become more difficult to address. I sent the memo to all 3 board members on a Sunday evening, then spent Monday trying to distract myself with job searching and apartment cleaning. I had no idea if they would take my concerns seriously or if they would even read my analysis. Tuesday morning, I got a call from an unknown number. Nyla, this is Patricia Hendricks from the board. I received your memo about the financial discrepancies. Can you make yourself available for a conversation this week? Patricia was the board member I'd worked with most closely on a major client presentation 2 years earlier. She was known for being thorough and fair, but also for not tolerating any kind of financial irregularities. Of course, I said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. I'm available whenever works for your schedule. We scheduled a call for Thursday morning. By Wednesday evening, Patricia called back. Nyla, I need to ask you not to discuss your memo with anyone else for the time being. We're bringing in external auditors to review the concerns you've raised, and we want to make sure the investigation isn't compromised. External auditors. They were taking this seriously. The next 2 weeks felt like the longest of my life. I had no inside information about what was happening at my former company, but I started hearing rumors through my professional network. Whispers about financial reviews and executive meetings that were running longer than usual. Then Elena called me. Have you been following the news about your former company? She asked. I hadn't been. I'd been deliberately avoiding industry news because it felt too painful to read about the place that had thrown me away. What news? I asked. They just announced that their acquisition of Zenith Technologies has been called off. Apparently, there were some internal financial issues that needed to be resolved first. And there are rumors that your former boss is taking an extended leave of absence. Extended leave of absence. That was corporate speak for, we're investigating you but haven't fired you yet. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with genuine surprise. I'd hoped my memo would trigger some kind of review, but I hadn't expected results this quickly or this dramatically. A week later, the business press reported that Dorian had resigned to pursue other opportunities. The announcement came on the same day that Zenith Technologies stock hit a new 12-month high, making any acquisition financially impossible for the foreseeable future. The irony was perfect. Dorian had fired me to protect an acquisition that was now completely out of reach, and his own manipulation had been exposed in the process. But I still wasn't satisfied. Getting Dorian fired felt like justice, but it didn't address the bigger problem of what came next for me. I'd been job searching for a month with limited success, and while I had decent savings, I needed to think strategically about my next move. That's when I got a call that changed everything. Nyla, this is Marcus Webb, Chief Technology Officer at Zenith Technologies. I've been hearing a lot about your background and expertise from some mutual connections. I was wondering if you might be interested in discussing a potential opportunity with us. Zenith Technologies. The company at the center of this entire situation wanted to talk to me about a job. Marcus and I met for lunch the following week at a restaurant that was nice but not ostentatiously expensive. The contrast with my termination lunch wasn't lost on me. "I'll be direct," Marcus said after we'd ordered. "We know there was some kind of corporate interest in acquiring us recently, and we know that interest has suddenly disappeared. We also know that someone with industry expertise helped bring attention to our actual value when the market was underestimating us." He paused and looked at me carefully. "We've been asking around about who might have that kind of insight into both our technology and the acquisition landscape. Your name keeps coming up." I chose my response carefully. I've always believed that good technology gets recognized eventually. Sometimes the market just needs help seeing what's already there. Marcus smiled. "That's exactly the kind of perspective we need as we think about our next phase of growth. We're looking for someone to lead our strategic partnerships and business development. Someone who understands both the technology and the market dynamics." The role he described was basically my dream job, leading innovation partnerships at a company whose technology I genuinely believed in, with equity compensation that could be worth millions if they continued growing. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as we finished our meal. "We've been thinking about acquiring some patents and smaller companies to accelerate our development. We'd want someone in this role to lead those efforts." I accepted their offer that afternoon. My first day at Zenith Technologies was exactly 6 weeks after Dorian had fired me over lunch. Instead of feeling defeated and disposable, I was walking into a leadership role at one of the most innovative companies in our industry. But the real satisfaction came 2 months later, when Marcus called me into his office with a proposition. "There's a portfolio of AI patents that just became available," he said. The company that was trying to acquire them had some kind of internal shakeup, and now they're looking to sell rather than develop them internally. The price is about 60% of what we would have paid 6 months ago. I knew exactly which patents he was talking about. They were the ones Dorian had been planning to acquire as part of his grand strategy. The ones that were supposed to make his career and cement his reputation as a visionary executive. "I think we should acquire them," I said. "They align perfectly with our development roadmap." The acquisition went through 3 weeks later. I signed the paperwork as Zenith's Director of Strategic Partnerships, acquiring the exact patents that Dorian had coveted for a fraction of their original asking price. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone directly. Sometimes it's about letting their own choices catch up with them while you build something better from the ashes they left behind. I never sent Dorian a message or called to gloat. I didn't need to. The industry is small enough that he definitely heard about my new role and about our patent acquisition. He'd understand exactly what had happened and how his own actions had created the opportunity for my success. 6 months later, I heard through mutual connections that Dorian had taken a much smaller role at a mid-tier consulting firm. His reputation for strategic vision had been permanently damaged by the failed acquisition and the financial irregularities that had been uncovered. Meanwhile, Zenith Technologies had grown into one of the most talked-about companies in our sector, and my equity stake was worth more than I'd made in my entire 8 years at my previous company. The patents we'd acquired became the foundation for 3 new product lines that generated over $200 million in revenue in their first year alone. I think about that termination lunch sometimes, about how confident Dorian was when he slid that envelope across the table, how certain he was that he was removing an obstacle to his grand plan. He was right about one thing: I was an obstacle, just not in the way he thought. The beautiful irony is that if he'd simply been honest with me about the company's direction, if he'd included me in strategic planning, instead of manipulating numbers to justify my removal, I probably would have helped him succeed. My client relationships and industry knowledge could have been assets to his acquisition strategy rather than threats. But he saw me as a smart girl who needed to be managed rather than a professional partner who could be trusted. That decision cost him everything he was working toward and gave me everything I'd been dreaming of. There's something poetic about the fact that his last day at the company came during a lunch meeting with the board chair at the same restaurant where he'd fired me. I didn't attend his farewell gathering, but I heard it was a small, awkward affair with mostly junior staff who felt obligated to show up. By then, I was already deep into my new role, working with technology that was 3 years ahead of anything my former company was developing. If you've made it this far in my story, could you please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about the way things worked out? Also, subscribe if you want to hear more stories about how the business world really works behind all the polished press releases and corporate speak. Because trust me, there are so many more stories where this one came from, and some of them are even crazier than what happened to me. The real story of what Dorian had been planning didn't fully come to light until almost a year later, when I was already settled into my new life at Zenith Technologies. I was in my office one Thursday morning when my assistant knocked on my door with an unusual expression on her face. "Nyla, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about your previous employer. Her name is Jessica Chen, and she says she used to work in their legal department." I'd never heard of Jessica Chen, but something about the way my assistant described her visit made me curious. "Send her in." Jessica was probably in her mid-40s, professionally dressed, but with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been dealing with something stressful for a while. She sat down across from my desk and got straight to the point. "I know this is unusual, but I need to tell you something about what really happened at your former company, about Dorian Blackwell, and why you were really fired." The use of his full name caught my attention. Most people in our industry just called him Dorian. "I'm listening," I said carefully. Jessica took a deep breath. "I was the legal counsel who was asked to draft the termination paperwork for your division. But what I discovered while doing that research made me realize that your firing was part of something much bigger and much more problematic than a simple restructuring." She pulled out a folder and placed it on my desk. "I've been debating whether to share this information for months, but when I heard about your success here at Zenith, I decided you deserved to know the full truth." I opened the folder and found copies of internal emails, financial projections, and legal memos that painted a picture of Dorian's scheme that was even more elaborate than I'd imagined. "He wasn't just manipulating departmental budgets," Jessica continued. "He was working with outside investors who were planning to short Zenith's stock before the acquisition announcement, then cover their positions after the deal went through. Your performance data was threatening that entire timeline because it contradicted his narrative about market conditions. Short selling. That meant Dorian and his collaborators were planning to make money both from the acquisition and from betting against Zenith's stock price. It was sophisticated financial manipulation that bordered on securities fraud." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Jessica looked uncomfortable. "Because I was asked to prepare legal defenses for what happened, and during that process, I realized that your termination was specifically designed to remove someone who might expose the whole scheme. I quit the company last month because I couldn't be part of covering this up." She pointed to one of the emails in the folder. "Look at the date on this message." The email was from Dorian to someone whose name I didn't recognize, sent 3 weeks before my termination lunch. The subject line read, "Nyla problem," and the content made my stomach turn. "Her client relationships and industry analysis are becoming a liability to the timeline. She's too close to the Zenith technology team and could potentially uncover discrepancies in our valuation model. Recommend immediate removal before Q3 presentations." Immediate removal. They'd been planning to fire me for weeks, maybe months, while I was working 60-hour weeks thinking I was contributing to the company's success. "There's more," Jessica said, pointing to another document. "Look at this financial projection." The spreadsheet showed the expected profits from both the acquisition and the coordinated stock manipulation. The numbers were staggering. They were planning to make over $400 million from a scheme that depended on keeping Zenith's true value hidden from the market. My firing wasn't just about protecting an acquisition. It was about protecting a conspiracy that could have made Dorian and his partners incredibly wealthy while destroying a company full of brilliant engineers and innovative technology. "Jessica, why didn't you report this to the SEC or the board while it was happening?" She looked ashamed. I was scared. Dorian had made it clear that anyone who interfered with his strategic initiatives would find their career prospects very limited. And I wasn't completely sure I understood what I was seeing until after everything fell apart. I spent the rest of that day reading through Jessica's documents and cross-referencing them with what I already knew. The picture that emerged was of a conspiracy that went far beyond corporate politics into potential criminal territory. But here's what struck me the most. They'd failed completely. Not only had their acquisition collapsed and their stock manipulation become impossible, but their target company, the one they'd tried to destroy, was now thriving beyond anything they could have imagined. Zenith Technologies had grown by 300% since I joined. Our patent acquisitions had positioned us as the leader in our sector, and our stock price had increased by over 800% in the past year. The company that Dorian had tried to acquire for pennies on the dollar was now worth more than his entire former company. And I was right in the center of it all, leading the strategic partnerships that were driving our growth. That evening, I called Elena Vasquez and asked if she'd be interested in investigating a story about stock manipulation and corporate fraud. I shared Jessica's documents with her, along with my own analysis of how the scheme had been designed to work. "This is incredible," Elena said after reviewing everything. "If this is accurate, it represents one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud attempts I've ever seen. And the fact that it backfired so spectacularly makes it even more remarkable." Elena's investigative report was published 6 weeks later in the most prestigious financial journal in our industry. The headline read, "The Acquisition That Never Was: How Corporate Manipulation Created Unintended Success." The article detailed the entire conspiracy without naming specific individuals, but anyone in our industry could connect the dots. It described how executives at an unnamed technology company had attempted to manipulate market conditions to facilitate a profitable acquisition, only to have their scheme collapse when their target company's true value was revealed to the market. The report also highlighted how the intended victim of the manipulation had not only survived but thrived, growing into one of the most successful companies in the sector while the conspirators faced professional ruin. The day Elena's article was published, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your success. You earned it, Jay." I assumed it was from Jessica, and I appreciated the sentiment, but I was more focused on the future than on celebrating the past. 6 months after Elena's article was published, I was promoted to Vice President of Strategic Innovation at Zenith Technologies. My equity package from that promotion was worth more money than I'd ever imagined having, and my role gave me the opportunity to shape the direction of our entire industry. But the most satisfying moment came during an industry conference where I was giving a keynote presentation about innovation partnerships. As I walked onto the stage, I saw a familiar face in the audience. Dorian was sitting in the back row, notepad in hand, apparently trying to learn from the presentation I was giving about the success strategies that his scheme had accidentally enabled. I didn't acknowledge his presence or change my presentation in any way. I simply delivered my prepared remarks about how authentic innovation requires trust, transparency, and long-term thinking rather than short-term manipulation. During the question and answer session, someone from the audience asked about challenges I'd faced in building strategic partnerships. "I think the biggest challenge," I said, looking directly at Dorian for just a moment, "is working with people who see collaboration as a zero-sum game rather than an opportunity for mutual growth. When you encounter that mindset, sometimes the best strategy is to simply build something better and let the results speak for themselves." After my presentation, several people approached me with business opportunities and partnership proposals. Dorian was not among them. Later that evening, at the conference networking reception, I was talking with a group of executives about emerging technology trends when someone behind me said, "Excuse me, Nyla?" I turned around to find Dorian standing there with what looked like a prepared speech ready. "I just wanted to say congratulations on your success," he said carefully. "It's impressive what you've built at Zenith." The group I'd been talking with suddenly became very interested in our conversation. Everyone in our industry knew the basic story of how I'd left my previous company and joined Zenith just before their major growth phase. "Thank you," I said simply. "It's been an incredible opportunity to work with such innovative technology and talented people. I hope there are no hard feelings about how things ended at our previous company," Dorian continued. "It was just business, you understand? Just business." The same phrase he'd used during our termination lunch. "Of course," I replied. I actually owe you a debt of gratitude. If you hadn't made the decisions you made, I never would have had the opportunity to be part of something this exciting. I could see him trying to figure out whether I was being sincere or sarcastic. The executives around us were definitely picking up on the tension in the conversation. Well, Dorian said awkwardly, I'm glad everything worked out for the best. It really did, I said with genuine warmth. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually just the beginning of something much better. He walked away, looking confused and slightly defeated. I went back to my conversation with the other executives, several of whom immediately asked for more details about partnership opportunities with Zenith. That night, lying in my hotel room, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that lunch 18 months earlier. I'd gone from being a disposable employee to being one of the most sought-after strategic minds in our industry. But more than that, I'd learned something important about resilience and revenge. The most powerful response to betrayal isn't destruction, it's creation. Building something so successful that your betrayer becomes irrelevant. Dorian had tried to eliminate me as a threat to his plans. Instead, he'd freed me to become a threat to his entire worldview about how business should work. A year later, I was featured on the cover of a major business magazine with the headline, The Innovation Disruptor. The article described how my approach to strategic partnerships was changing the way technology companies thought about growth and collaboration. In the interview, the journalist asked about my previous experience and what had motivated my current success. I learned that being underestimated can be an advantage, I said. When people think they can dismiss you or manipulate you, they stop paying attention to what you're actually capable of. That oversight creates opportunities for those who are willing to work strategically and think long-term. The journalist pressed for more details about my transition between companies, but I kept my answers focused on the positive aspects of my current role, rather than dwelling on past grievances. The most important thing I learned, I concluded, is that your response to adversity defines your future much more than the adversity itself. You can choose to be bitter, or you can choose to be better. 3 years after my termination lunch, Zenith Technologies announced that we were acquiring my former company's technology division, the same division that Dorian had worked so hard to manipulate. The irony was perfect. The company he'd tried to acquire was now acquiring pieces of his former employer. I wasn't directly involved in that acquisition negotiation, but I did review the strategic assessment that justified the purchase. The conclusion was that while the target division had solid technology, their leadership and strategic vision had been inadequate for years. The acquisition went through without any drama. Most of the employees from my former division were retained, but several executives, including some who had been part of Dorian's inner circle, were not offered positions in the combined company. By then, I'd been promoted again, this time to Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. My role involved setting the long-term direction for a company that was now valued at over $8 billion. I kept Jessica's folder of documents in my office filing cabinet, not because I needed them anymore, but because they reminded me of how quickly things can change when people underestimate the consequences of their actions. Sometimes former colleagues would ask me about my amazing luck in timing my transition to Zenith just before their explosive growth. I'd always smile and say that preparation and opportunity tend to find each other. The truth is that there was nothing lucky about what happened. Dorian created the conditions for his own downfall by prioritizing short-term manipulation over long-term value creation. I just happened to be positioned to benefit when his approach inevitably failed. Last month, I heard that Dorian had started his own consulting firm, specializing in helping struggling companies identify acquisition targets. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was trying to monetize the same strategic thinking that had destroyed his corporate career. I genuinely hope he's learned from his mistakes and is approaching business differently now. Not because I forgive what he did, but because I've moved so far beyond that experience that his success or failure doesn't affect my life anymore. My current life is everything I dreamed of when I was working those 60-hour weeks in my previous role. I lead a team of brilliant strategists, work with cutting-edge technology, and have the financial security that comes from building something valuable rather than just working for someone else's vision. But the most satisfying part isn't the money or the recognition. It's knowing that I've built something authentic and sustainable, something that creates value for everyone involved rather than extracting value through manipulation. The patents we acquired, the ones Dorian had coveted so desperately, became the foundation for technology that's now used by millions of people every day. Products that make people's lives easier and more connected. That's the kind of legacy I want to be part of. When I think about that termination lunch now, I feel grateful rather than angry. Dorian thought he was ending my story, but he was actually just editing out the boring chapters so the interesting part could begin. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I need you to do something for me. First, smash that like button because this story shows what's possible when you refuse to let other people define your worth. Second, leave a comment telling me about a time when someone underestimated you because I want to hear how you proved them wrong. And finally, subscribe and ring that notification bell because I've got so many more stories about how the business world really works when you look behind the corporate public relations. The most important thing I want you to take away from my story is this. When someone tries to diminish you or throw you away, they're usually telling you more about their own limitations than yours. Your job isn't to prove them wrong through destruction or revenge. Your job is to prove them irrelevant through creation and success. Sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't getting even. It's getting ahead.